I tend to get a lot of tomatoes thrown at me because I speak positively about things that have a negative perception, annuities, reverse mortgages. But it's really about retirement is different from pre-retirement. You have more risk in retirement. You have to stretch your money out over an unknown length of time. You don't know how long you're going to live. And then when you're spending from your assets, it's just investment risk behaves differently.
Welcome back to another episode of our podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Wade Pfau, a nationally acclaimed retirement expert and founder of Retirement Researcher. Wade holds a PhD in economics from Princeton. He is a professor of practice at the American College of Financial Services and is the author of the recently updated book, which is probably the most thorough guide on retirement, and it's called Retirement Planning Guidebook, Navigating Important Decisions for Retirement Success. Thank you so much, Wade, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
In your book, you talk about the 4 L's of retirement: longevity, lifestyle, liquidity, and legacy. Is there any one that's more important than the other ones? And what do the 4 L's entail?
Oh, sure. So it's a nice alliteration about the financial goals of retirement. Longevity is about making sure you have your basics covered no matter how long you live. Lifestyle is about just enjoying things that may be a little more discretionary, but nice to have is a great quality of life in retirement. Legacy is about what you want to leave behind to the next generation. And liquidity is just making sure you have resources for unexpected events that you may not have budgeted for, the healthcare bills or replacing a roof, or in retirement, long-term care can also be an issue. They are all important considerations. Certainly longevity is probably where people look at first. Step 1 of retirement is just to make sure you can have basic expenses covered no matter how long you live. Although for a lot of people, Social Security would be an important part of having resources to cover your longevity. But yeah, I definitely would start there.
We've all heard of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, which basically is that 80% of your outcomes is determined by just 20% of the inputs. What is the 80-20 principle of retirement when it comes to retirement finances?
That's a great question, especially within the research. There's a lot of debate about things like what is the safe withdrawal rate, like how much can you spend from your investments and so forth. And that would be a great place for the 80-20 principle, that at the end of the day, people are going to be flexible. And as long as you have a spending rate somewhere in the ballpark of, say, 3 to 5%, and the more you're willing to make adjustments, the higher that can trend. At the end of the day, that's probably sufficient, and you don't have to do the extra 80% of the effort to fine tune that to a very specific number down to 2 decimal places and so forth. People can make adjustments, and they have Social Security as a backdrop. And so that goes a long way towards 20% of the effort. It gets you pretty far with having a retirement income plan.
Where does Social Security rank in terms of this? For most people, Social Security is their biggest financial asset going forward. And then you get into the big dilemma of what age should I start taking it at? Should I take it at 62 or should I wait until I'm 70? Would you say that for the vast majority of Americans, the Social Security is the largest chunk of their retirement income?
Yes, definitely. It's an asset. And when you look at the lifetime benefits you'll receive for a couple so 2 people and then higher earners throughout their career, they could potentially receive more than $1 million from Social Security. And that may be vastly more than they have in other financial assets. It may be the biggest asset on their balance sheet. I do advocate strongly for at least the high earner in a couple. Every couple is going to have a low earner and a high earner. The high earner is special because their benefit also becomes a survivor benefit. But it is important for the high earner to consider delaying to age 70. I think it is a big mistake for 2 people in a couple to both claim at 62. The lower earner might ultimately decide to claim at 62. But the high earner delaying till 70, you get such a boost to your benefits that as long as you live past your early 80s, which is below life expectancy, people may not realize, for couples in their 60s, they're going to have more lifetime benefits through Social Security. by having that high earner delay and having that foundation, both for that individual as well as the survivor benefit if that individual passes away before the spouse.
I was looking at the Office of Actuary of the Social Security Administration, looking at their life expectancy tables. And you mentioned this in your book, which is why I was looking at this. But basically, for a 60-year-old man, you have a life expectancy of about almost 82. And for that 60-year-old female, you have a life expectancy of 85. So if you make it to 60, so if you're talking about taking the Social Security at 62 instead of 66 or 70, you probably will outlive and recoup the money that would be missing out on, right? If you were to just take it at 62.
Right. And those life expectancies you mentioned, they underestimate things a little bit because the way Social Security looks at it, they look in a particular calendar year and the probability of surviving at each particular age. But we always expect longevity to improve over time. And so if you're 60 today, the mortality rate for today's 80-year-old is not going to be the mortality rate for you when you're 80. It'll be lower when you're 80. So people will actually live longer than what those particular life table estimates suggest. Plus, anyone who's listening to a podcast about talking about retirement planning will tend to have a longer term focus and more of a focus on planning, and potentially will live longer than the average American. So that those life table numbers are for everyone in the United States. But you're listening to this probably a little bit special in terms of, now, of course, accidents can happen, illnesses can happen, but your expectation, your average longevity would be higher than the number for the average American overall. So late 80s is probably more realistic rather than, say, 82 or 85.
Yeah, it seemed like in the research I was doing that if you take it at 62 versus 70, the break-even point is right around 80 to 81 years old, somewhere in there. So if you're going to live to be 90, you're talking a decade extra. That's huge. And like you're saying, for people that are probably listening to this podcast are probably living closer to the 85, 90 mark than, say, 75.
Yeah. And after adjusting for inflation as well, just inflation adjusted, you're getting 77% more benefits by delaying to 70 than claiming at 62 every year after that for the rest of your life. So that's where you have to do that calculation. Well, how long do I have to live for it to be more overall? And that's where you get to the early 80s is the answer.
Is that one of retirees or someone that's getting close to retirement age in their low 60s or say at 60 years old? Is that the single biggest decision that they have to make, is when they are going to start collecting Social Security? Like, what is the biggest retirement decision for someone that's, say, 55, 60 in that age group?
For most people, that will be the decision that has the biggest impact on their overall retirement finances, for sure, because home equity is a big asset. What an investment portfolio can be a big asset, but Social Security for most people will be their biggest asset. And there's such a stark difference in the lifetime benefits you receive, depending on when you claim, that yeah, absolutely. Kind of, well, what's the most important decision to make with retirement when to claim Social Security? That would be the answer for most people.
Right. In your book, Retirement Planning Guidebook, you mentioned that when you decide to take it could be the difference in over six figures and over $100,000. And that's a massive amount of money, especially if, isn't the largest fear, the greatest fear of retirees is running out of money, is outliving their retirement. So that would be a huge difference if you waited till 70 and you lived to be 85 versus taking it at 62. And if both of them ran out of their assets, what are you getting, like something like 50% more at that age? Just in Social Security?
Well, 77% more, or 76 or 77, depending on precisely when your full retirement age.
You're talking 76% more. So you're talking a quarter away from double.
Right. and that's under this idea that you ran out of investment assets. So all you have left is Social Security. It's a lot more if you waited till 70. So it's providing that longevity protection. It's inflation adjusted. It's backed by the US government. I know concerns people have is, well, is Social Security going to disappear? And that's not really in the cards, even with this idea that the trust fund is expected to deplete in the early 2030s. There's still payroll taxes coming in that will cover 75 to 80% of promised benefits. And so with other tweaks to the program, there may be small cuts to Social Security benefits, but I don't think listeners should be worried that it's going to disappear, because that's often an argument. I should just claim as soon as possible because it's going away and I should get what I can out of it before that happens. I think that's not the case at all, that people don't have to be worried about Social Security going away. They should make the decision based on the idea that Social Security will be there over the long term.
We opened this podcast with the 4 L's, and one of the L's was lifestyle. So if you're 62 years old and you just hate your job, it seems like maybe you're just going to grab Social Security, because the most common age, almost a third of retirees actually start collecting at 62. So there is definitely a lifestyle component though too, isn't it? Like maybe you'll enjoy, 62 to 72 versus say 70 to 80, whatever. And then as you mentioned in the book, you can taper the money off. You get out of retirement, you're back in high school, right? You're having fun with your friends and you're spending a bunch of money, but then maybe you get to like 72, 73 and you're just kind of chilling out at home and you're not spending as much money anyway. Because if you're talking just straight money, you probably wait till you're 70. But if you're talking lifestyle as well, maybe 62 would be the time to take the Social Security.
Yeah, for individuals who don't have other financial assets, they may not really have much choice other than to take it at 62. But the other side of this is, if you do have investment assets, it's okay to spend those down more quickly. You don't want to spend everything because you do need some liquidity for unexpected events. But it is okay to spend down other assets more quickly while delaying Social Security, because then after 70, with such a bigger benefit, you don't have to spend as much on your other investments at that point. So you don't have to sacrifice enjoying your 60s while you're delaying Social Security. It is okay to spend other assets. And you're right, as people age, they do tend to cut back on other spending. It may not happen by the early 70s, especially as people are healthier and living longer. But certainly by your 80s, in many cases, people are cutting back. They're not going on as many trips. They may not be going to restaurants. They may be just spending more time at home and so forth, and spending less after that point. And so in that regard, having that foundation with Social Security, they may not have to spend much beyond that. And so that's another reason why it can be okay to spend down other financial assets while you're delaying Social Security.
What are the 5 most important things that a retiree needs to think about before they hit retirement? Before they hit, say, full retirement age? And one of the things I liked about it in your book is you talked about, like, if you're an insurance salesman, then insurance is the best thing in the world. If you're selling stocks, then stocks is the best thing in the world. The average person, they just want the best comprehensive plan. They don't want to be sold something that they don't need just because the person selling it relies on that as their source of income. But what would be a fully comprehensive top 5 things that a person getting close to retirement needs to really have locked in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we covered Social Security. That definitely be on the list. Medicare, decisions around Medicare. Do I want to go on original Medicare? Do I want a supplement, Medigap or supplemental policy? Do I prefer Medicare Advantage? That's a huge decision. I think what you're kind of hinting at as well is this idea, I call it retirement income styles. What broad approach do you want to take? And there are different options. There are more investment-based approaches that talk about things like the 4% rule, which is, if I have a portfolio of 50 to 75% stocks, I should be able to take 4% of that and sustain that spending with inflation growth over retirement. Or do I want more of a safety first approach, which would layer in on top of my Social Security? Maybe I do want some annuity to provide lifetime income protections and so forth. There are different retirement styles, and they're all potentially viable approaches. And so just having that foundation to understand, what am I most comfortable with for my own self, not necessarily what's being pitched to me through different financial services, whether it's the insurance side or whether it is the investment side. They both have that conflict of wanting to promote what they offer as being the best for everyone. Figuring out what is truly the most comfortable for me to use in my own retirement. That would be a huge part of it. Where you want to live in retirement is a huge issue, whether you want to stay in your current home, whether you want to move somewhere else. I know you recently had an episode about the villages in Florida. That's one example of many of, do people want to move to a place like that? Or do they want to stay where they are? Do they, with their friends and community and family? Or do they want to have 2 different homes? But just that whole concept of where do I want to live in retirement would be a 4th one. then it would be a good fifth consideration. There's a bunch of things you want to make sure you have covered. Do I have a plan for long-term care? Have I thought about tax planning opportunities so that I don't get hit by surprises with taxes in retirement, with how Social Security is taxed at higher income levels, whether I have to pay surcharges on my Medicare premiums and so forth, and also estate type issues. Do I have a plan for if I'm incapacitated? Is there someone who can easily access the information they need to manage the finances for my household? Legacy? Do I have a will? Do I have an estate plan? That sort of thing. That's all important to consider as well.
And the research I was doing and talking to my parents who are retired, they're retired in Panama, the country, half the year, and they live in the state of Wisconsin the other half. But like, say you have a second house and then you sell that second house when you're retired, say you're 70. Well, then your Medicare premiums basically what are like maxed out because you're paying the capital gains. So then you're paying like $600 a month on your Medicare versus if you say sold that house before you were 65. And then if you have IRA accounts, you're paying the money you withdraw out of your IRA counts as provisional income. So then up to 85% of your Social Security is taxed. So maybe like, I don't know, maybe doing like a Roth conversion in your 50s to shelter some of that tax withdrawal. And then depending on where you're at, certain states tax Social Security while other states don't, which is why I think Florida is probably a popular destination, but Colorado and Alaska and those other states that tax your Social Security. So there's so many different factors. I feel like in your 50s, you really have to set this stuff up, or certainly before you turn 65, you have to have your ducks in a row, else you're going to be, what's the difference between what's the lowest Medicare, like $150 a month, $160 a month versus $600, and then that's per person. So for a married couple, you're looking at $14,000. That's a huge chunk of money if you're on a fixed income, even if you did sell a house or whatever.
Yeah. This is IRMA is the nickname for the Medicare premium surcharges. It's IRMAA, the income-related monthly adjustment amounts. I look at some tax planning case studies in my book. I usually look at the case of they're 62 years old and they're retired. So they're going to have an 8-year window before they start Social Security where they don't have a lot of other income. And so doing things like Roth conversions. Now, you're definitely right about selling a property and realizing a big capital gains. That can trigger IRMA surcharges, which people really hate them. It's not necessarily the end of the world because it's not permanent. It's for 1 year, you may have to pay, yes, per individual, another $6,000 at the top level per person in Medicare premiums. So an extra $12,000 for a couple. If there's a really big capital gain on a property sale, that may be an unfortunate side effect. But you definitely don't want to be accidentally triggering IRMA surcharges on a consistent basis. Required minimum distributions that begin now at age 73, and for people born in 1960 or later, they'll begin at age 75. That is also a big surprise because that can force income out of the IRA that's ordinary income that can push you over those thresholds, which in 2024, the threshold is $206,000. There's 5 different thresholds, but the first one where you get hit by higher Medicare premiums, it's $206,000 for a couple, $103,000 for a person filing single, where then you do have those surcharges after that. Social Security taxation is a big one as well. It's going to be at lower income levels than, like, you're not going to have to worry about the Social Security tax torpedo, as it's called, and the IRMA thresholds at the same time. Because if you're getting hit by IRMA surcharges, you're already paying tax on 85% of your Social Security benefits. But if you have lower income levels than that, you can potentially manage things so that you're not having to pay tax on as much of your Social Security benefits. And in the case studies I look at in my book, if they just follow conventional wisdom advice about how to spend down assets in retirement, they end up paying tax on 85% of their Social Security for much of their retirement. Versus if they do Roth conversions in those years in their 60s and they lower that IRA balance, get it shifted over to a Roth IRA before they start Social Security, and not entirely get it moved over, but a big chunk of it moved over, they may only have to pay tax on, say, 30, 40% of their Social Security benefits. So it can have a huge impact because that's a lot of money that you're no longer paying taxes on. That's a good example of this tax planning. You manage that Social Security tax torpedo, which it's the nickname for the weird way that Social Security benefits get taxed. When you have other taxable income, you get this compounding effect that it also forces more of your Social Security to be taxable as well. But then once you get through that phase, then you've got some capacity, but then eventually you get into this Medicare surcharge problem as well.
Yeah, that tax torpedo, tax tornado, whatever you want to call it. I think you want to avoid that.
Yes, and required minimum distributions may make it harder to avoid that, but that's where planning in advance to get your IRA balance down to get it converted to a Roth. Then you don't have as big of required minimum distributions. And then you may be in a better position where you're not fully impacted by the tax torpedo for Social Security.
Towards the beginning, when we were talking about the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, would converting things to a Roth be part of that 80-20 along with that Social Security when to start taking that? Like, how important, if you're saying that you could save 30% on taxes, that seems like that would be part of the 80-20 rule, one of the more important components.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to put that into the 80-20 principles, but this is complicated, this tax planning, because there's so many, I call them nonlinearities in the tax code. And that just means as you generate more income, it's not a straight line of how that impacts taxes. Your taxes go up for a while, down for a while. It's very complicated. And so you can't just blindly enter into this world of, okay, I'll do some Roth conversions this year. You have to figure out with more precision what you should be doing. And that's what would make it difficult to be in the purely 80-20 principle of things that would be part of the easy 20% to get done.
You mentioned before about how people are fearful that Social Security won't be around. And then, you say that it will, which I agree with you. But what happens is they just modify it. And these modifications make it so convoluted. And as you mentioned in the book numerous times, you could call the Social Security Administration office and they have no idea what they're talking about. You're getting some person that is new, or it's so convoluted that they don't actually know whatever specific rule. And as we go forward, it gets more complex because they need to modify it to keep it solvent. Like, I mean, wasn't originally Social Security was your first, your highest 10 years, right? The highest 10 years that you had. Now it's the highest 420 months or 35 years. So if you were a stay-at-home mom for, say, 15 years, and then you worked, say, 20 years, whatever, you have a bunch of zeros in there, which really lowers your amount that you're getting per month. And so maybe they'll make it like, hey, maybe we'll take your 50 years and then you have 30 zeros in there or whatever. Then it lowers your total. And you also mentioned in the book how as you get, I think in your 60s, how much money you make in your 60s impact? Is it like weighted heavier than if what you're making in your 50s once you get closer to that 65?
Well, it's just generally wages increase over time. That like the average wage level in the US increases over time. So people will tend to naturally have higher wages entering into the formula that calculates your average lifetime, 35 years. Now, before you reach age 60, they adjust those past wages to account for average wage growth in the economy. But then after age 60, you kind of get that impact that your age 60 incomes can have it's more likely, if you're still full-time working, it's more likely they'll enter into your top 35 years if you've been working more than 35 years.
Right. It kind of pulls up your average. I guess my main point before I got sidetracked was that they'll just make modifications right to it. Right. So like it'll be solvent. We won't have to worry about that, but it'll just be more and more convoluted. And I'm actually shocked when I was doing research for this video. The views on this retirement stuff, I was actually pretty surprised how low they were because it's so complex. Like you're talking, when you take your Social Security it could be over $100,000. How you set up your Medicare and how you sell assets off could result in tens of thousands of dollars. How you do your Roth conversion, again, you're talking 30% tax. Over the course of, say, the final 20, 25 years of your life, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars just between a few, 3 or 4 components of this.
Yeah, it is complicated. Like Social Security, it's been collecting new rules since it was created in 1935, and it gets more complicated every time there's new rules. The last major Social Security reform was in 1983. That's when they started to increase the full retirement age from 65 to 67. But just in terms of people being worried about Social Security going away, these reforms are usually phased in. So that in 1983, they decided that people born in 1960 or later are going to be hit by that age 67 full retirement age. Well, they were only 23 years old. in 1983. So they had a long runway to plan for that to happen. And when we see subsequent reforms, maybe there'll be a small increase in the payroll tax rate. Maybe, like you said, they could increase the number of years used in the calculations, which would work as a benefit cut. They could increase the full retirement age further. There'll be a combination of reforms that might have a small decrease to benefits, but it would be phased in over a long period of time. And yeah, it's probably going to be more complicated. It seems like every time there's any new legislation impacting retirement, it moves in the direction of making things more complicated rather than less complicated.
How important is relocation in a strategy? You could go to another state where you're not having income tax, where you have a lower property tax, warm weather, which I think probably as you get older is certainly more important. You move to Dallas to get into some warmth, and you're certainly not elderly. So, but how much would you say location would be a factor into this?
That's a really personal decision about where people want to live. And ultimately that part is more important than any financial aspects. But yeah, one way to save is to move to an area with maybe a lower cost of living, not just simply lower taxes, but a lower overall cost of living, but then lower tax situation, maybe a state with no income tax. There can be some surprises. The property taxes might be higher in states with no income taxes, or you have to look at homeowners insurance, which can be higher in areas that tend to be lower tax, and that may offset some of the other tax savings. But the relocation decision has to be driven partly by the financial considerations, but also just you want to be happy in retirement. And so moving somewhere different to save money isn't necessarily going to give you a better overall satisfaction in retirement if it's hard, like for people who struggle to make new friends, meet new people and so forth. Or if you want to live close to family, maybe the relocation is to live closer to family. You may have adult children who move somewhere. You may now have grandchildren, then you want to move closer to them. That could drive the relocation decision. But then where you're relocating to is somewhat out of your control because it's more driven by your children and where they have their careers and where they decide to move. So there's a lot that goes into that. But those would be some of the things to think about.
You've been this retirement guru for decades now. What are some of the most common questions that you get asked?
Oh, so I'm a little bit more on the technical side. So I do get more technical kinds of questions. People are always asking about the quote unquote safe withdrawal rate from investments, whether it's 4% or whether it should be less than that or more than that. And so that's an area where I really initially started establishing my name. And the answer is not simple to that question. There's a lot of factors that go into what is an appropriate withdrawal rate. More recently, my research has focused more on some of these tax planning issues. And so I get a lot of questions on that. A lot of questions on Social Security claiming because it is so complicated for couples. It's so complicated because Social Security was originally designed with the idea that only one person in the household would be working. And now that we have many households where both spouses are working, Social Security wasn't really designed for that. And so spousal benefits and survivor benefits and everything else gets very complicated for that reason. So a lot of questions about that. Get a lot of questions on Medicare and how, if you're still working after age 65, should you stay with your employer-based health insurance or switch to Medicare? What if you have a spouse? Should they stay on your plan or should they go on Medicare? Those sorts of things are probably where most... Oh, and also I write a lot about annuities as well, which is a really misunderstood topic in terms of, do they add value? Are they too expensive? That sort of thing. And there's many different types of annuities that all work differently. So I get a lot of questions about different types of annuities as well.
What's your overall thought on annuities?
Well, I think they can play an important role for people whose retirement income style is more looking for safety and protection for income and also comfortable committing to something over the long term in retirement, that they can be a stable source of reliable income. There's different types of annuities, but really simple income annuities provide you a premium in exchange for a lifetime income. They work a lot like Social Security. They don't have flexibility in that you can't get your money back out of them, but they also don't, when people say annuities are high fee, they're not talking about simple income annuities. They tend to be talking about more like variable annuities. But then you also have fixed index annuities. And with those, they give you more flexibility and you can add in a lifetime income benefit to be a source of lifetime income. So they shouldn't be dismissed entirely. They're not appropriate for everyone, but at least there's good competitively priced annuities out there for people who want that protection. It's a worthwhile consideration. And the financial service professionals who create commercials about, oh, I hate annuities and so should you, they're really misleading consumers about the potential role for annuities in retirement.
One of the things that I thought your book highlighted was you probably will live longer than you think. Like people, like you mentioned, people blame like, oh, I got family history, or I just don't think I'm going to live that long. But if you make it to 65 years old, the average male will live to be 83 and the average female will live to be 86 if you do make it to 65. So maybe annuities having that security, because what if you live to be 90 or 95, which if you're making it to 86, and I read a stat that said that if a married couple makes it to 65, there's almost a 20% chance that one of the two will live to be 95 or older. 18%, I think, was the exact number, but that's basically 1 out of 5 couples that are married at age 65 could live to be 95 or older. That's a huge possibility.
Yeah, as part of the 80-20 rule and looking for simple things, there is a really convenient website from the Society of Actuaries. It's longevityillustrator.org. It's all one word, Longevity Illustrator. And it lets you put in for one person or a couple, just your age, gender, do you smoke or not? Is your health good, average, or poor? And based on those inputs, it'll give you a lot more information about your projected longevity. And people in good or average health, and especially non-smokers, that, yes, for a couple, that 20% number you mentioned about living to 95, it could be closer to 50% for a couple in good health who don't smoke.
My parents are 60. No, my dad just actually had a birthday yesterday.
Oh.
But anyways, happy birthday, Dad, if you're watching. But anyways, pretty sure they're 67 now, 66, 67. But they have probably like 60, 70 really close friends, and they're all in that same age. So they have all been retiring the last, say, decade or so. And they say like they would have like, oh, like I had neck pain, or I had this knee pain, or I had this whatever. And then as soon as they hit retirement, all those pains go away. It was all just caused by stress at work. These were people that were like, oh, I'm not even going to make it to 75. And then all of a sudden, once they retire, they're like, oh, damn, I feel 20 years younger. So I feel like as soon as you actually get out of that stressful environment and you have time to decompress and sleep in and get back to exercising and eating healthy because you have time, plus now you're having fun. So it's like, damn, I actually want to live to be 90 now versus like grinding out at work and like, actually, I don't care if I die tomorrow or whatever. And now you have this zest for life again. It's easy when you're at the office every day, not really thinking like, oh, I'm going to live to be 90. But as soon as you hit retirement, maybe that's a real possibility. And you want to actually hit 90.
Yeah, that's a great outlook and perspective. And that's an important part. No, not everyone has that kind of positive transition into retirement, because for a lot of people, when you quit working, you don't just lose the salary, but you had structure for 8 hours of the day. You had social connections with your coworkers. You may feel like you're an important part of society through the work you're doing. And in losing those kinds of things, for some people, retirement, though they're looking forward to retirement, and there can be a honeymoon phase where retirement's going great, but maybe whether it's 6 months or a year into retirement, there's suddenly, okay, now what do? I don't have this structured 8 hours of the day I'm spending at work. I don't know what to do with myself. And that can lead to negative feelings or depression. So it is important to find purpose and passion and something to get you up in the morning. And for the people you're talking about who are able to do that successfully right away, that's fantastic. But for listeners in general, that won't be the experience of everyone when they get to retirement. They may need to make some effort to find purpose and passion in their retirement as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, my parents live in Panama. There's this expat community. And as you mentioned about how one of my previous episodes is the villages. And I think that kind of does give you meaning, right? You're with people your same age. You have all these activities. If you're just staying in your same house in, Boston or whatever, and all your other friends are still working, your kids are working, it seems like that could maybe make you bored or whatever. But if you're moving to a retirement community where everyone else, it's like whenever I visit my parents, it's like being back in high school. I feel like I'm the adult in the room and I'm the youngest person there.
Yeah. And that's an important part of what you're saying about relocation earlier, is in that kind of a retirement community, there can be a lot more social activities and social engagement. And if you do decide to stay age in place, sometimes people in the suburbs, as they get older and they start to lose mobility and it gets harder to get around, they may feel more isolated. And so an important aspect of thinking about where you want to live in retirement is just planning ahead for the opportunities to continue that social engagement, which is so important to feeling good in retirement.
One of my former coworkers, his name's Bob, and he's 61. I told him I was doing this podcast. He has a kind of a technical question. It's probably a fairly common question nowadays, but he was actually quite confused by it. He works for the state of Colorado. He's a state employee, and he's in a para fund. And so when you're in a para fund, you basically don't pay Social Security. You pay into the para fund. But then Social Security has what's called the WEP, which is the Windfall Elimination provision, which basically means that your Social Security can be reduced. How do people actually navigate the Windfall Elimination provision, and what are strategies to maximize their Social Security or para or both in this situation? And not just say specific to Colorado, but other states. This is very common for other states as well.
Yeah, for a lot of public employees and even teachers in certain states, they may have a separate pension system, so they're not contributing to Social Security during the years. Now, for the windfall elimination provision to be relevant, you have to spend part of your career in Social Security covered work and part of your career in non-covered work, like public employee or whatever the case may be. The idea is Social Security is progressive. Like the higher your lifetime income, the lower the replacement rate. So the thought was, if you say worked in a Social Security covered job for 15 years, and then you worked in a different kind of job for say 20 years, and you had a big pension from that, from Social Security's perspective, you look like you had a lower lifetime income because you only had 15 years of contributions. So you get a disproportionately higher benefit from Social Security. The windfall elimination provision was designed to cut that back by just noting, okay, you have a pension from elsewhere, so we're not going to give you as much Social Security. If you can contribute 30 years into Social Security, the windfall elimination provision goes away. Otherwise, it would apply when you have that non-covered part of your career outside of Social Security as well. In terms of how you might manage that, again, if you could get 30 years of work outside of Social Security, there's no more windfall elimination provision. Otherwise, every year counts because every year of work in that range, it impacts the initial replacement factor, which is typically 90% of your lifetime earnings. With the windfall elimination provision, that can get all the way down to 40%. And so each year of work is going to help get that closer to 90%. And that's really the only practical way to deal with it. People may think it's unfair, but it was just designed because you do have another pension as well. And if you got a bigger Social Security benefit because it looked like you had less lifetime earnings and you got that big pension from somewhere else too, you have a much higher amount than you would have had you just been working in Social Security the whole time. That's the reason for it.
I would imagine, though, if you're talking, like you're saying, teachers, state employees, police officers, firefighters, whatever, working at, being a snowplowman for a county, whatever. And if you worked in one of these jobs for 30 years, if that's the case, you're getting your Social Security reduced by 40%, and there's really nothing you can do.
But if you've never worked in Social Security covered a job because you spent your entire career in something outside of Social Security, you're not getting any Social Security benefit.
You're not getting any Social Security, right? So basically, you'd have to work to get Social Security. You have to work 10 years minimum, right? 10 years. Paying into right. So if you worked 9 years and then 9 years, paying into it, but then you work 30 years, say paying into a para, then you're getting nothing out of Social Security.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, you might want to find a job to get one more year of employment in to qualify for something from Social Security. But then you'd have 10 years in Social Security, and then you would, instead of getting that 90% replacement factor on those earnings, you'd be pushed down to 40%. So you wouldn't get a big benefit, but you'd get something. Whereas with 9 years of work, you don't get anything.
Yeah, because this particular person, he was a police officer since 1983, and I'm not sure how many years he paid into Social Security. Most of it I thought was into his pension for the state. It's so complex. I'm not even close to retirement now. I've probably read 35 retirement books the last 3 or 4 months, and I've been more stressed out. I had to turn a YouTube video off. I'm like, man, I don't even want to think about this. And then Bob, I was talking to my friend Bob about this, but he's totally stressed out about it because he's, like I said, he's 61. So it's like, yeah, once you get, because you're right. That could be, let's say you paid into Social Security for 7 years. maybe you need to get another 3 years, and that probably would be a smart move.
And it doesn't require a lot of earnings to qualify for those credits. It's 10 years of work, but it's more technically 40 quarters of work. And I think you just need a couple $1,000s of income to qualify for a quarter. And you can continue to earn past retirement ages for Social Security. You can be earning in your 70s and so forth. So a part-time job to get a little bit extra income could also help you qualify for Social Security in that kind of situation, even if you're in your 60s or 70s.
What are some of the take-home messages? We've talked about a lot of different things, bounced around a lot, but what are a few take-home messages? Your book, it's a guidebook. It's over 500 pages. A lot of the books I've read cover just one aspect. You cover everything. This is a very comprehensive book. So what would be just a few really big take-home messages?
I'd say step one, think about your retirement style. Do I want to take more of an investment-based approach? Am I comfortable with that? Would I benefit from thinking about annuities and that sort of thing as well? Either approach is fine, viable. It's just what are you most comfortable with? Do put some effort into making a good decision with Social Security, because like what we talked about, that can be the most important financial decision you make for retirement. You do need a plan for healthcare. And if you're younger, then most people will qualify for Medicare at age 65. So if you're retiring before that, you need to make sure you've got a plan for healthcare to get you to age 65. And then when you do get to 65, it's mainly, do I want to go with the original Medicare? And if I don't have any other type of retiree health insurance, do I want a good supplement to help offset what Medicare doesn't cover? Or do I want to take that Medicare Advantage route? And now it's Medicare Advantage is a newer part of Medicare that even in the 10 years ago, maybe only 15 or 20% of people use Medicare Advantage. It's now over 50%. So that's what all the commercials are about. When you see Medicare commercials, it's for Medicare Advantage. So which direction do you want to go with that? And you need basic planning for what do I do if I experience a long-term care event? Is there any sort of tax planning I might be able to do? Do I have my basic estate plan in place? And that's really the non-financial aspects are important. Like we were talking about purpose and passion. Like you want to be able to retire to something, not retire from something. You don't want to retire just because you hate your job. You want to retire because there's something better you want to spend your time doing. So being thoughtful about that, investing in non-financial things, investing in relationships and friendships and so forth, and not just thinking that everything's going to change the day I retire. You may need to put some effort into having relationships in place. So you're not, okay, when I retire, I'll start spending time with my friends. Well, you got to make sure they're still going to be your friends at that point, that sort of investing in those relationships. Those are the main takeaways I suggest thinking about as you start getting closer to retirement.
You mentioned the 4 L's for the third time today: longevity, lifestyle, liquidity, and legacy. Long-term care, I don't know if that's part of the longevity L, but it certainly could be an L. And then I like what you said.
But yeah, it's part of the liquidity.
Right. It's part of and then I also read your chapter around reverse mortgages. And for a lot of people, their house is maybe their biggest asset, or certainly one of their biggest assets. And then how you handle housing. And then going back to the long-term care, if you don't have extra insurance, you could have a spend down and really destroy your nest egg that you built your whole career on. So it seemed like to me the long-term care and then what you do with your house were also two really important strategies to retirement.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about reverse mortgages much yet, but that's another area where I kind of get a lot of tomatoes thrown at me because I speak positively about things that have a negative perception, annuities, reverse mortgages. But it's really about retirement is different from pre-retirement. You have more risk in retirement. You have to stretch your money out over an unknown length of time. You don't know how long you're going to live. And then when you're spending from your assets, it's just investment risk behaves differently. It's if I'm spending from a portfolio that's losing because markets are down, I can dig a hole that becomes harder to recover from. And that's where things like annuities or reverse mortgages can make more sense in the context of retirement income. So that, yeah, it's once you decide where you're going to live in retirement, if you're going to own a home and you anticipate staying in that home and you're at least age 62, a variable rate home equity conversion mortgage, which is the more formal name for what most people think of as a reverse mortgage, has a growing line of credit that can be a really interesting and useful tool to consider as part of the retirement plan as well.
And then in terms of long-term care, you mentioned the stat 70% of people will at some point experience a long-term care situation. But then you also mentioned that it's like 100 days, and depending on how you want to define that. But it seemed like at least a lot of people will have some type of situation where they're going to have extended either hospital or bed rest, whatever you want to say.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, there's a number, 70% of people experience a long-term care event. And you'll see that number everywhere, but I think it's a little bit overhyped because it includes short-term things, which really long-term care means a longer period of time, not a week in a hospital, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, people do need to understand Medicare does not pay for long-term care. You need something different, and whether that's to be self-funding from assets that you have. And if people spend down all their assets, Medicaid, that's the health insurance for individuals that don't have other financial resources, not Medicare, but Medicaid will pay for long-term care, or long-term care insurance. There's traditional long-term care insurance, which is not popular so much because premium increases and so forth, or some sort of hybrid approach that combines long-term care with either life insurance or an annuity. Those are really the main options out there for thinking about long-term care.
Yeah. At a certain age, I'm not sure what age, maybe 75, it seems like you really have to have that locked in if you're concerned about having to do that spend down, right? And then if you have a younger spouse, that could really impact their retirement as well.
Mm-hmm. Unpaid caregiving is a big issue. If the spouse has to take care, that can create a lot of complications and also like hurt the health of the spouse who's the caregiver, making it more likely that they'll also need long-term care. Relying on your adult children to be caregivers can completely disrupt their careers and be very costly in financial terms from their perspective as well. And so it is a really important issue to think about. And often it can be harder to qualify for long-term care insurance as you get older, because as soon as any sort of health condition arises that in the underwriting process would get flagged, you may not qualify for long-term care insurance. So the kind of conventional wisdom is to consider by your 50s whether you want long-term care insurance, because it just because of the risk that it may be harder to qualify after that point.
And I also think you mentioned in your book, you talked about the number of retirees that actually have a mortgage. Ideally, you want to have your mortgage paid off before you get into retirement. I think, did you mention like 30% of people 65 or so still have a mortgage? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's been increasing that more and more people are entering their 60s or entering retirement with a mortgage. And it creates more risk because you have this large fixed expense in your early retirement years that's going to put more pressure on your investment assets if you're taking distributions to make the mortgage payments. So from a risk perspective, if you're like, this is back with retirement styles, if you have more of a safety first outlook where you're more worried about financial market volatility and so forth, psychologically, it can make sense to just get that mortgage paid off before entering retirement. But when you look into the financial services world, you'll also see a lot of people advocating for just carrying mortgages for as long as possible, with the idea that this is a way to leverage your investment assets, that you'll earn more on your investments than the mortgage interest rate. And so you're better off by having a mortgage. But that's a riskier proposition, because if your investments don't outperform the mortgage interest rate, you're falling behind with that scenario. But for people that like financial market risk, that's the motivation for arguing to keep the mortgage. But no, I think a lot of people just psychologically would prefer not to have that risk and would feel more comfortable if they did have their mortgage paid off before they leave work and enter retirement.
Yeah, it seemed like as you get older, you should certainly factor in risk mitigation, as I would think at the very top of the list. And then researching this, there's a lot of people that are like, hey, take your Social Security at 62, as soon as you can take it, and then invest that money. But if you take it at full retirement age, which is what, 67, 66, depending on what the year you're born, you're taking a 30% reduction. And it's like, what did Bernie Madoff promise people? Like 8% a year or whatever. And then after the age of 67, you get 8% a year until you turn 70 extra for that 24%. So you're getting Bernie Madoff type of production guaranteed. So like,
yeah,
it seems like you're
a study on that about a year ago with Steve Parrish at the American College, where we just looked in the historical data, assuming you got historical financial market returns which perform better. This idea of, well, if I claim it, I'm retired at 62, should I claim at 62? And then I don't have to take as much out of my investments. So I let my investments grow. I'm leveraging my investments that way. Or do I spend my investments down more quickly to age 70 and then claim and get a much higher benefit thereafter? What's going to support the largest value for my investments at, say, age 85 or age 95? And certainly there are historical cases where you would have been better off to claim early and just let your investments ride. But it's not more than half the time. And it depends, how aggressively are you going to invest? If you're someone who may be less than 50% stocks in retirement, you're very unlikely to benefit from this idea of claiming early and investing the difference. If you were going to invest more aggressively in retirement, the odds are improved that you could benefit from claiming early. But it's risky. And the odds, when markets don't do well, you would be much better off by delaying Social Security and getting that higher benefit subsequently after age 70.
So Dr. Wade Pfau is joining us today, author of the book Retirement Planning Guidebook, Navigating Important Decisions for Retirement Success. I just have two final questions for you, Wade. One just is, where can people get your updated book? When does the updated book come out? Where can people find you? You have your own business. You're founder of the Retirement Researcher. So you can give us that information first. And then secondly, just leave us with a final thought, whether it's related to your book, to retirement, anything that you're thinking about, just whatever Wade wants to leave us with.
Okay, great. Well, the book, it's the easiest to find it is at Amazon. This is what it looks like. I don't have, by the time you see this, there'll be a version that says 2024, the second edition 2024 updates. So that's what I would look for. That's out at the end of January in 2024. Retirement Planning Guidebook, available at Amazon or other book outlets. If you go to books2read.com/retirement, there's a whole list of other places if you like Apple Books and so forth. But Amazon, certainly for either the paperback or hard copy version, Amazon would be the easiest way to find it. Beyond that, right, my website is retirementresearcher.com. It's all one word.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.